Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, it's a big one. We're going to be talking about the comeback album from Porcupine Tree Closure Continuation. But this is one of those reviews almost too big to even approach. And that means I got to have some help with this one. So let's cut to that.
And we're here, folks. And here's our special guest today, Notes Reviews. How's it going, man?
Good to be here. Good to talk about some new progressive rock-ish stuff. So yeah, happy to be
Prog
here.
rock, prog metal, somewhere in between.
Somewhere around there. Yeah, we know our boy Steven Wilson doesn't like the whole P word, but we're going to use it for now.
Apparently, that was an interesting thing to discover in some interviews I was digging up about this project. Just to lay some foundation with here is that I actually collaborated with Notes Reviews over on their channel, just being able to go through and articulate our lengthy thoughts surrounding Porcupine Tree. It's about an hour and a half long. We go through the entire catalog, and there's some rather distinctive variances in opinion. There will be a link attached. I recommend you go check that out. The one thing I wanted to establish there is that we have some differing opinions surrounding what we think are the best albums out of Steven Wilson's catalog, and specifically Porcupine Tree, that might lead to some variance in our overall opinions here, but it does lay a lot of the context surrounding what we might say here. And specifically one thing that I want to start with. We both like Porcupine Tree, so if we're going to be nitpicky, establish that there's a baseline of quality here that we're going to be traveling with.
Yeah. There's a reason why so many people put these guys as like the poster child for like modern prog. So yeah.
Exactly. And I also think that, again, when we have an idea of where we're coming from and a lot of highs and lows with Steven Wilson. Well, okay, I'll start there. What was your expectations going into this?
I didn't have a lot. Mainly because, so the last two Steven Wilson projects, I wasn't a big fan of. I know a lot of people liked the new direction he was going in terms of more accessible, popular approach of music. That's not really my bag. I'm much more of his experimental 70s prog stuff. So because a lot of the news circuit for this album was this was written between The Incident, their last album, and now, and just kind of collaborating with that, putting a lot of the fine polishes off in the past 2 years, I didn't have too much of high expectations outside of the legacy of this band, outside of some interesting, good music, and somewhere intertwining Steven Wilson's creative touch at some point. So the expectations were lukewarm, I think, on my side.
Did you catch any of the singles before going in?
I didn't. I went in completely blind, and that's how I've tried to approach a lot of music, because I listened to half of The Raven That Refused to Sing, the Steven Wilson's big album that I love, and I had heard more than half the album by the time I actually had the project in my hand.
Yeah.
And it just didn't connect as much. Subsequently, it's my favorite album of his, but that initial listen, I think, was diluted because I had listened to all the singles beforehand. So I went in blind.
Makes sense. Yeah. I think when I was going into this, I did not check out any singles beforehand as well, especially as there was 4 singles out of 7 tracks. One thing I want to stress here is that we're going to predominantly focusing on the original standard cut of the album. There's 3 additional tracks that we'll touch on, but they're not part of the album. Ends at Chimera Rex. The one thing I also want to say is that when you have 4 singles off a 7-track album, it kind of feels a little redundant.
A little bit, yeah.
I'll also say I was kind of on a downswing with Steven Wilson, because The Future Bites I did not like. It's got its moments, and I think I'm charitable to it because I like Steven Wilson, but at the same time, there was something about that album just rubbed me the wrong way. One thing I also do want to say here, and this is what I found interesting reading a lot of interviews, is that this is probably his most collaborative album to date, especially when it comes to working with Richard and Gavin, having a lot more involvement in songwriting.
Absolutely. The only one that I can think of that Steven Wilson was a part of was maybe the Storm Corrosion project that he and Michael did from Opeth.
Right.
Because the two of them basically split the entire album working collaboratively, but that was just the two of them. Everything else, it was either Steven spearheading and people helping him out, or somebody else spearheading and Steven doing stuff behind the scenes. I definitely feel more of a collaboration in terms of a Porcupine Tree on this album than almost any other album from them so far.
Okay, so let's get to the meat of this. Did you like it?
Yes. I think I can. I mean, I've liked and loved all of Porcupine Tree's albums up to this point. I don't think that there's an album from them that I can say I don't like. And this is one that I also really, really enjoyed. I don't think it's as good as some of their past works, but I think for where they are currently, this is the best album they could have put out from where they are currently.
Okay. I went into this with low expectations, and you know what? They were met.
Okay.
I also feel I need to stress this. This is not a bad album. I don't think Steven Wilson under Porcupine Tree has released an album I consider as bad. Even if I have frustrating issues with Deadwing, and that's just a me thing, I also don't think that album is bad per se. It's just frustrating. It's got its moments that will ultimately redeem it and keep it away from getting a failing grade, even though I don't do grades anymore. This is the sort of project I feel it was tough to get a handle on. And I want to start by saying that a lot of the things that we like about Steven Wilson are still very much here. The production's fantastic. Again.
It's great. Yeah. On a good set of headphones or a good sound system, it is like immaculate.
But I hate to say that we immediately say we kind of expect that at this point. But
I mean, the boys have been nominated for what, 5 Grammys for surround sound mixing. So, he's got it, but
and that's the thing. It becomes, there are certain instruments and there's certain elements that you it's the baseline. It sets that baseline of quality, which I can appreciate immediately. And I don't want to knock him points because it's the expected thing. Because I'd also argue there's other elements in this album that I think really pop off really well. The one thing you'll note is that Steven Wilson's playing the bass lines on the entire project because of the departure of their bassist. And it's actually very obvious in the compositions, at least to my point of view, because when the bass surfaces, or just how they start off with that bass lick on Harridan, there's just that much more presence of it. And the integration with a lot of the melodies, specifically in the guitar lines, is a lot more pronounced, at least to me.
Absolutely. Like he treats, and he's said this so many times in interviews, he's treating the bass like a guitar. So the rhythm sections really have to be picked up by the drums and the keyboards. Because a lot of those rhythm sections aren't being led by the bass. It's reminding me of like the Raven that refused to sing, and how frontal the bass line was, especially within the mixing and how it was being presented as an instrument. And it was both a good and maybe not a great thing, because I don't know, like as much as I loved more of the rhythmic aspects of this album, it was either too much or not enough at different times when being presented with the bass and the rhythm sections that most of the time it should provide.
I actually agree with you there. The one thing that kind of popped out at me is like, well, Harridan strikes off with such a prominence in how it's put forward. And you can also tell that Gavin had a lot more of a hand in the writing of that song because of how prominent the percussion is. One thing I noticed about the mixing of this project is that you can very clearly tell that when somebody had more of a writing role on the song, their elements in the mix felt a little louder. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, because I think there were some elements where it actually really pays dividends when Steven Wilson gets a little bit more acoustic, brings in more of the layers and the guitar harmonies, and some of the vocal harmonies are very prominent and they sound beautiful. At the same time, though, you can kind of tell when Gavin has the lead on a song, and it can be a bit distracting.
A little bit, and I know you're not as big of a fan of Gavin as most other people are in comparisons of Porcupine Tree's past drummers. But I think because Gavin comes from more of a jazz background, that's kind of how he's treating the drums, in that, okay, when it's my turn to shine, I'm just going to blow everybody down. But when it's not, I'm no longer a drummer, I'm a timekeeper. So, and that, it moves very quickly from one to the other, very prominently.
Let's talk about song structure with this album, because this is one thing where I think there has been a departure, or there's been some unevenness since like the 2000s, because and this is actually kind of what threw me at first couple of listens, because the one thing that I really loved about his pop era is that there was that focus on hooks. There was that focus on more directed and focused songs. And this album doesn't really have that, not to the same degree.
No, and that was something that I noted a couple of times within the song structure. There's a lot of moments where there's like a mini crescendo or like a pop of music, and then it just fades out. And it feels like they are jamming with no real intent or real endpoint in mind for song structure. Like, it's great jamming, but there's, in terms of like song structure, I don't know, it doesn't have that same kind of command that a lot of their other tracks did.
And that makes sense, because what Wilson said alongside that, a lot of the tracks were coming out of Genesis points when he was just jamming with Gavin. And you can tell. But at the same time, I think that ultimately pulls away from some of the things that made Porcupine Tree's individual tracks so special. Like, I'll say this, like, the song structure issues, we brought this up when we covered The Incident in the tier list, and that a lot of the songs could feel a little bit amorphous. I think there is a lot of great melodic ideas across that album, like that main riff that comes through on Dignity, for instance. Beautiful song, phenomenal song. But at the same time, it often feels like the song is kind of coiling and searching around itself to get back to that riff. And it doesn't end where it's supposed to.
That's so Dignity by far is my favorite track off this whole piece. Like, by a pretty far margin. I love the midsection because it reminded me of there's a riff that they use within the guitars that reminds me of a Goo Goo Dolls track.
Oh, okay.
And it took me so long to try to figure it out, because as I was listening to it, I'm like, this is very clearly, what was it? It was Slide.
Okay.
Little less notes, but the same kind of chord structure. So it felt like that punched in the face with like Seal's Kiss by a Rose within the actual plethora of music. But I feel like at the 4-minute mark, maybe 5-minute mark, that's where the song proper kind of should have maybe ended, because they didn't have a clear idea of how to end the track after so much of that beautiful moments with the Mellotrons and Richard coming on with his style of music. And it brought all three of them together. And I'm like, this is one of the best compositions that Porcupine Tree has done. It reminded me of some of the better, in a very, very long while. Like, it was reminding me of some of those more breathtaking moments from Luminal, from The Raven That Refused to Sing, from Stephen Wilson's like proper music, or proper solo
solo music.
But then they just keep going. And even as somebody who loves prog, I'm like, wait, are you going somewhere interesting? Oh, you're just redoing what's already been done. Was there a plan for this at the beginning, or are you just continuing to go because you wanted to make an 8-minute track?
And that's something I want to highlight here. All these songs feel too long.
The only one that I think has justification for feeling a little bit long is the last proper track of Chimera Wreck. Everything else, I think, is a little bit too long for the more jamming, like improvisation. Wow, that was a like improv style of writing that they're going for. They needed to tighten it up a little bit more, kind of like what King Crimson was doing on Lark's Tongue, where they were really tightening things up in that sense.
Well, the interesting thing is the one song that I actually I think Dignity is, in my opinion, second best song, because the track I actually really like was Of the New Day. Because
interesting.
Because it's one of the smoother songs on the project, but what I really liked was how, as much as they kept on changing time signature across the hook, and it's very obvious, it's got a bit of a jerky, like kind of shifting flow to it, but it always felt like it actually circled back and actually managed to pull it together. It's one of those examples of where the complexity is obvious, but once you wrap your head around it, it makes sense. And it's also probably the most optimistic song on the album, which I appreciated.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I love the Dignity middle part, because of how optimistic and how fresh it felt. But yeah, Of the New Day is definitely more of that like happier approach that I was feeling from. And that was something that I noticed as the album overall. It felt like a they were taking moments from everything from about Lightbulb Sun all the way to Deadwing, like those 3 albums with In Absentia in the center. Because it doesn't really feel like anything that came before or after those 3 albums outside of like pieces here and there in different solo projects. And Of the New Day kind of summarized that a little bit, especially with a lot of those like very punchy moments that kind of held back off, and then punchy moments that held back off again.
Yeah, and you know what? This is one thing that actually I agree with you, especially in calling back to Deadwing, because Rat's Return really had a lot of that to me, just in terms of how those chunkier riffs came through, and some of the symphonic elements. That was something that felt new to me in terms of what I would expect coming from a Porcupine Tree album, and I'm not sure how much I liked them. Like texturally, they felt a little weird, especially when you realize that it was all being created without like a symphony orchestra backing it. Like it was very much done in-house. And again, that's kind of the realities of what was going to be expected from a Porcupine Tree record coming out of the past couple of years. But at the same time, it felt a little weird.
Yeah, and I don't know. Rat's Returns, I know a lot of people will love, especially like the musicians that will just like pour over the note sequences, try to reproduce it. And I think there's a lot to dig into in that one. But I don't know. I didn't connect with Rat Returns all that much, mainly because it felt like a lot of the more chunky moments from, like, again, I keep going to The Raven That Refused to Sing with the Holy Drinker and the Watchmaker, because of this more jazzy approach to it. And in terms of the orchestration, especially like the use of different sounds that Richard is using, it reminded me a lot from Stephen Wilson's Grace for Drowning, especially on the second disc of that, which was interesting because I know you're not a big fan of that. So I was going to ask you, I was going to say, how did you like Rat's Returns when it had so many of those like orchestrations and moments on it?
I didn't think it was bad, but I also felt like it didn't coalesce. Like I felt like I was waiting for a climax point that didn't happen, which is generally my statement for the majority of this album. I hate to say it. Like I feel like I kept waiting for moments that would explode, and Dignity has that central lick that really gets there. Harridan's got points that get there, but we also get to songs like Heard Culling.
No, I'm not a big fan of this one, and it might be one of my least favorite moments on the track.
Same.
Or on this, mainly because of that start-stop that so many of these tracks have, where there's not a real clear thought of where they wanted to go with this one. I will admit the star performer on this one, and I think the main orchestrator for this is Gavin because of his drumming. But because of that, I think he leaves Stephen and Richard a little bit in the wings and trying to like keep up with him as he's changing the tempo all the time. And I'm like, I don't know, it felt like some of the weaker moments from Deadwing, like Halo or like Personal Shopper from Future Bites, but like jam packed together without thinking of, okay, where do we want to go with this music?
Do you think this was a song that was like built in pieces? Because that's one of the things I kept coming back to with this album is that, it's coming out of jam sessions, but there's also a weird chunkiness to parts of these compositions that they don't flow as well as they should. And it feels like, and again, some of that stop-start stuff, it might best be some of the prog jazzier side of it. But I also get the feeling that some of these feel like they're the sort of songs that you work on back in 2012 and you come back to 10 years later and you're trying to fit pieces together to stitch them all.
Yeah, I would agree to that. And I think they even said, like, if we were able to collaborate together, like in person, they would have a much different album. But because they were sending each other demos back and forth and kind of piecemealing it, it does kind of feel that because they don't feel like unified tracks. And I think a lot of people in the prog sphere are going to really like that because it reminds me, I already said it once with King Crimson and Lark's Tongue, it does feel like that jazzier approach, but I'm not a big fan of that King Crimson iteration. I'm much more of a fan of when they came together with a clear thought and worked towards that thought and built up a crescendo, like the midpoint in Dignity.
Right. So, okay, one thing this is one of the tracks where I actually have a production complaint, and this is Walk the Plank. I hated that drum machine. Like, you can very obviously tell that they wanted to do something a little bit more synth focused. They wanted to do something that was closer in mind to some of the popular elements that Steven Wilson's been embracing the past couple of years.
Yeah.
I just think the mixing of that drum machine it didn't blend well with the rest of the percussion. I feel like the atmospherics didn't resolve effectively. And you know what? If you're gonna make a song called Walk the Plank and you don't have more of a rollicking pirate vibe, what the hell are you doing?
Honestly, I mean, Prague has their pirate tracks already, like Emerson, Lake and Palmer's Pirates and Fido's Tempest of Mutiny. But like, I don't know, Walk the Plank for me, I noted that it was his attempt once again to try to bring that 80s synth pop back into a prog fold. And I don't know if he's cracked the code yet for that, because it just felt like Bonnie the Cat or from some of the tracks from the Future Bites, where the thing that brings it down for me, though, is what Steven is doing with his voice by trying to put this raspy aspect to it that I don't know why he's doing it. I don't know. At least he's not doing a Trent Reznor impression anymore, like he did with Bonnie the Cat. But this was just, I don't know. It didn't quite work for me all that much.
The odd thing with a lot of the singing on the album is that more often than not, Steven Wilson sounds more confident and as comfortable as a frontman. I think there's good moments, but at the same time, he's also leaning on his falsetto a lot more. I noticed this with Herd Culling. I don't think it works because, again, the big knock against Porcupine Tree is that I don't think Steven Wilson's a great singer, and he's effective for what he is, but this is also showing him trying to experiment and test his range. But I'm not always sure the songs are constructed for him to do it well, or that he feels well supported by the compositions that we get.
Yeah, I'm honestly surprised that Steven hasn't done more with vocal manipulations, like what Genesis was doing with Peter Gabriel's voice on Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, where there was so much testing and trying of different like sound effects and soundscapes on the vocal works. I'm surprised Steven has never really tried that before with his own vocals.
Well, I would say that, but then I also take a look at the lyrics, and here's the thing. I don't think these lyrics would work if they're being synthesized or to go into a different direction like that. And let's dig into this briefly here. I think the lyrics, I think there's an idea here that's not bad. I think the idea of trying to confront with endings, dealing with the nostalgia for those that have already ended is not healthy, or the leaders that will abuse their power will face their comeuppance, and somehow we have to continuing on. I think there's ideas there, but man, I think they whiffed the ending. I really think they whiffed the ending.
Unfortunately, that's the original sin of Porcupine Tree. Like, they have really great ideas, but they just can't execute it to the full potential. That was the biggest issue with the incident, and I think that's the biggest issue here. Great ideas, the whole idea of continuing closure, and even a good idea as looking at this album in fullness of their whole discography of like, is this a continuation? Is this a closure? It could go either way, but man, like, they really whiffed the ending in that sense.
Well, I think Chimera Rex, where he's basically like, I'm okay for this all to be over. Like, I'm not afraid of it anymore. And I'm like, and then when you pair it with the frankly surprising amount of meta text that slips onto the bonus tracks, where it's very much of, well, like, it's not going to meet your expectations. You got to keep going down, living life. And I'm like, yeah, that's fair. It's not a bad idea, but I'm also not sure that's the message you want for your big comeback album that a lot of fans have been waiting for decades. Like
12 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Chimera Rex is my second favorite track, but but mainly because of the jam session. Like, it's very reminiscent of the jams from Gravity Eyelids or Prodigal Point 3. But yeah, in terms of, I don't know, lyrical content, I can kind of take it or leave it. I do find it ironic that the last three tracks, the three bonus tracks, function much more as singles and like actual realized tracks than almost anything that came before it. Yeah.
And I would agree with you. I think the Never Have is, in terms of like being an individual song, is really solid. Love in the Past Tense bugs me because I really don't like that plucky kind of synthetic tone that they use for a lot of the guitars and how they have that layered. I don't think it sounds great. It also sounds a little dated.
A little bit, yeah. It reminded me of a lot of the points on the Future Bites where it was dead on arrival. It's like, okay, this is music that came, 2, 3, in this case, 5 years ago. Doesn't really work in today's context, but at least Never Had. It was fun, but again, these last 3 tracks are fun, but nothing to write home about.
Right.
Yeah.
And that bugs me with this album because I feel like there's moments I appreciate and there's glimpses of what this comeback could have been, but it feels, I don't know if Steven Wilson not being in the driver's seat kind of hurt it, or it's one of those cases where maybe it's the sort of continuation and closure that we didn't need. Like, again, it's an album that feels like it's its own self-fulfilling prophecy.
A little bit, yeah. It almost like it really depends on what they decide to do next. Because in one case, I could see this being a transitional album where the next album they do is either pure jazz or like pure jam sessions, or it's, I can't even begin to try to guess where they're going.
Or they don't release anything at all.
And that's it. And this really is the last nail in the coffin for them.
Yeah, because on the one thing that I kept running through this and that kept bothering me is that when some of the motifs kept coming back and the realization that we've seen Porcupine Tree explore a lot of these elements before, I had myself wondering whether or not they just were out of ideas or whether or not they weren't going to, or let me rephrase that, out of thematic ideas, not in terms of compositions.
It did feel like, again, and they had said this a lot in interviews, these were moments and ideas that they had from the incident to like 2019 or so.
Yeah.
And nothing, I feel like when they went in to polish this off, they didn't really bring in any new ideas to kind of bring it all together. And that is both, I guess, very interesting because it provides a time capsule of all the music that they've been writing between then and now. But on the other hand, it doesn't really create a satisfying listen from beginning to end.
Yeah. So, okay, where would you think this slots into terms of their catalog?
In terms of their catalog, like, it's hard, right? Because there's a lot of moments on this that I feel has some of the best Porcupine Tree moments on it. Like some of the best Porcupine Tree music, I think they really nailed it in terms of getting ideas down. But in terms of like a fully realized album, I'm wavering between like this side of their better stuff. Yeah, I want to put this like around my enjoyment of, say, a Dead Wing or In Absentia, but not quite as good as, say, like Fear of a Bleak Planet or some of the more like heavy hitting moments from the incident. That's kind of where I'm at for this.
I think I'm a little cooler on it. I think my overall thinking is that it's better than the incident, but it doesn't have the best moments of the incident. Like,
I could see that.
I don't think there's a song here that's better than Time Flies. I don't think this rises to the level of my favorites from them. Like, I don't think this is a Fear of the Blank Planet, Lightbulb Sun. I don't think it hits In Absentia at all. But I also don't think that it's their worst either. It's a comeback that leaves me very conflicted. And I have to say this, and this is probably not a good thing for me to admit. The first couple of times I was listening to this, I was sitting in the backseat of the car on a road trip, and I fell asleep multiple times listening to this album. And it's bad. It was twice it happened. It really, I don't want to admit that, but at the same time, the production was great. Like, I get why. But at the same time, when you have a lot of ideas that don't coalesce, that's kind of what happens.
I mean, I was very similar in the same boat, but I was the one that was driving on a road trip, so I couldn't fall asleep.
Good for you.
But I did find, like, I was zoning in and out quite often on my first about 5 listens, and it wasn't until like a half dozen listens that I was like, okay, starting to get through it, starting to understand it. And from a prog's perspective, that's really great, and I love revisiting albums that I didn't quite get the first time and getting more out of it. But as one of my friends says, in terms of a holistic music approach, you shouldn't have to do work in order to enjoy music.
Yeah. And this album felt like it was difficult, but in interesting ways, and I do appreciate it. And ultimately, I like the album, but
same.
I had I had low expectations and they were met, but I'm still disappointed.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those, like, I like it with an asterisk. Like, it's like, I love it. There's a lot of things that I love about this album, but there's also some things that, yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So Notes, where can they find you?
On YouTube. My socials are Notes Reviews. Twitter, Instagram. I'm not really on Facebook. So you can find me all there. But yeah, YouTube is my big place to find me, and I do reviews at least twice a week. So yeah,
nice stuff. So I will have links down to everything there below. For everyone else, again, this was really great collaborating with you. This was a long time work in the making, and it was certainly good to talk to you.
Oh, great to be here. Happy to do it.
But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be extremely grateful. Please also subscribe to Notes Reviews. I'm sure they'd really appreciate it. Again, they do a lot of great work within prog rock and prog metal, and again, having insight into that niche is greatly appreciated. Beyond that, though, I'm sure y'all have comments. Leave them down there below. It's bound to be pretty interesting. But outside of that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. I'm currently in the headlong rush to get stuff out before the mid-year, so expect a bunch more shorts and then that larger mid-year video closer to the end of this week. But hey, if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process, support the channel, or hell, just find an excuse to argue with me on Discord, link to my Patreon is right over there. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.